Women's rights. We want to vote. The right to better paying jobs. I drew this poster in the early 1980s when I was probably 9 years old. I was writing about the women's suffrage campaign in the United States. I learned that women had fought for 3/4 of a century before they won the right to vote. I didn't learn that many women were still prevented from voting, and that women continued to fight for their rights throughout the next century. The historical record was and still is far from complete. Gaps in that record, due to policy, prejudice, or simply neglect, are being filled in with archival material. In preparation for the centennial of women's suffrage in the US next year, institutions are searching their archival holdings for narratives that will take us beyond the basic history we thought we knew. This is archives in action. We've made a lot of progress since women got the vote in 1920, but much less progress since I drew that poster. Women still earn less than men, and while they spend more on books, women write fewer books and are written about far less than men. This might be because the best of these works are rooted in archival research, and women's archives and research institutions still lag behind those of men. The preservation of unique material, documenting our experience as women, is crucial to understanding and advancing gender equality. And you can't write about what isn't there. So what am I talking about? What is archival material? On a very basic level, archival material is proof that we existed. It's the stuff that's left over when we're gone. At their best, archives provide evidence not just of work produced, but of a life lived. It lends a human dimension to our achievements. It gives a context for our work, in and out of the home. Diaries, scrapbooks, even emails, hard drives, other kinds of correspondence, photo albums, audio and video recordings, annotated books, diplomas, receipts, ticket stubs, pretty much anything is fair game if you can get it to tell a story. This logbook, signed by Virginia Woolf as a child, proves that she did, in fact, make it to the lighthouse. The wear and tear on Emily Dickinson's bedroom floor lets us guess at her pacing patterns as she composed her poetry. But it's not all about women as famous as Woolf and Dickinson. Archival feminist material I've handled often documents the lives and achievements of women who, but for the preservation of that material, would have been lost to history. Women who served in the military, who became our first doctors and lawyers, women who studied or even taught in the sciences at a time when they were dominated by men, women who traveled, who ran businesses, who raised families, or who simply documented day-to-day life in a specific time and place. There's a domestic difference between women's archives and men's, whether in the style of preservation, such as scrapbooking, or in the material itself. There's a domestic component to nearly all of the women's archives I've worked with. The day-to-day context of women's lives creeps into their work and subsequently into their archives. Women, more so than men, can hardly help it. In women's archives is an unrelenting sense that their working conditions, which were and often still are largely domestic conditions, matter. That in a very real sense, context is content. Take, for example, Marilynne Robinson. Robinson won the Pulitzer for Gilead, but is likely still best known for her first novel, Housekeeping, a female coming-of-age story juxtaposing homemaking with the open road. Robinson wrote Housekeeping while pursuing her PhD in Shakespearean studies and raising 2 small children. Her notebooks from that period include manuscript drafts of passages from the novel, interleaved with class notes and coursework for her graduate program, and drafts of letters, including 2 drafts of her first letter to the woman who would become her literary agent. Interleaved with these items are drawings by her children, and perhaps, not surprisingly, the names and numbers of childcare companies. It's not something I've ever seen in a man's archive. Here's another example. Anne Petrie. Anne Petrie is best known for writing The Street, an internationally best-selling novel from 1946 about a single mother in Harlem. With it, Petrie illuminated the social injustices endured by the working poor. Though Petrie herself was married, her husband was serving in the military while she wrote the book, based on her experiences and her observations during her decade in Harlem. Petrie wrote hundreds of letters home to her family in Connecticut, documenting her day-to-day life, providing the context which became the content of The Street. Another favorite of mine is Lillian Ross. Lillian Ross was an important voice at the New Yorker magazine for over 60 years. She was hired to replace men who were fighting in the Second World War, and at first she was edited by men to give her writing a male voice. Her earliest work was printed without her byline. Within 5 years, Ross had made her career writing largely about men, but publishing under her own name, including a book called Picture, about the director John Huston, with which she invented the genre of nonfiction novel. Like Petrie's and Robinson's archives, Ross's archive juxtaposes her work and life. Her editorial correspondence is filed side by side with notes from her son, like this one. Dear Mom, here's to a mother who is wonderful. Happy Mother's Day. Love, Eric. Photos of her interview subjects are juxtaposed with candids of herself, including a very early mirror selfie she took in the middle there. Despite Ross's male subjects, women were among her avid readers. I find this fan letter in her archive particularly moving. It's from a grateful housewife writing about Ross's groundbreaking profile of Ernest Hemingway. Dear Miss Ross, had the eeriest experience. Right in the middle of washing the clothes, cleaning the house, and 8 million other confining chores, attendant upon caring for a couple of children. I spent, through you, a couple of days with Ernest Hemingway. Thanks. Thanks an awful lot. Babette Cohen, 225 East 74th Street, New York, New York. How is this material connected? What unites Anne Petrie, Marilyn Robinson, Lillian Ross, and Babette Cohen with us? Some women's archives have individual value because the women are well known. The voices of unknown women can gain importance as part of the aggregate, or even individually through association, as with Babette Cohen. What all these women have in common is that each has shared an important first-person narrative of what it meant to be a woman in a certain time, place, and field. Lillian Ross shows us this through her archive, filling 50 boxes. Babette Cohen tells us this in a single letter. Each contributed her voice, not just to her own narrative, but to the continuous historical record of the shared female experience. I've said women are written about less than men. Let's take a look at a few women's archives that have been written about. Some archives in action.
Baby likes.
There you go. Motown historian Peter Benjaminson preserved the audio recording of his interview with Florence Ballard, whose voice you just heard singing one of her few solos with the Supremes. Ballard was a founding member of the Supremes, who broke the race barrier in the US and topped the international charts. When Benjaminson met her, Ballard was a depressed single mother of 3, living on government assistance in Detroit. She had been kicked out of the Supremes and was deprived not only of past financial gain, but also of the ability to market herself as a Motown alum. With one newspaper article from his interview, Benjaminson ignited efforts toward her redemption just before her unexpected death. Through that act of preservation, by interviewing her and publishing about her, Benjaminson brought to the fore important source material for the play Dreamgirls, which led to the award-winning film. Margaret Atwood, on commission from the Dobkin Family Collection of Feminism, annotated a first edition of The Handmaid's Tale. Thanks to Atwood's manuscript notes and comments throughout this copy of the book, we have a greater understanding of her creative process. And we have her authority on sources and references, as well as occasional manuscript and photographic documentation of her work. I hear what you're thinking. I'm not a biographer. I'm not Margaret Atwood. So here's an example perhaps closer to our own experience. The rescue story of these records from the Manhattan Trade School for Girls. These records provide photographs and descriptions of 400 individual young female students in New York in the 1920s, when women had just received the vote. They tell us about their individual educational background, the professions of their working-class parents, and their own employment opportunities. They come to us from Paul Lucas, who 70 years later, in the hallway of a completely other school, simply opened a drawer in a file cabinet labeled "for trash." He wrote up the records, reporting on their aggregate power to give us insight not only into a moment of women's educational history, but also into the economic climate and labor conditions of the time for both genders. Despite sometimes difficult circumstances in the lives of these young women, Lucas found evidence, he wrote, of the American dream taking place. Surely this is not trash. Surely it's not. You never know. Something you didn't even know you saved might make sense decades later, or might help you make more sense of yourself. I have no recollection of creating this poster, and yet after a quarter-century career in feminist archives, it helps me see a narrative arc to a life I certainly had not planned in grammar school. So you can't necessarily anticipate how material will be used, the gaps in the historical narrative it might one day fill. Create your own narrative for yourself. Leave the rest to posterity. All you need to remember is this: they can't write about you if you're not there. Not enough information is being retrieved from its primary sources, ourselves and our ancestors. I began today by noting the gaps in the historical record resulting from policy, prejudice, or simply neglect. Policies are changing, past prejudices are being addressed, but too much material is still being lost to neglect. The survival of those records of the Manhattan Trade School for Girls illustrates the fulfillment of a rescue mission mandate we can all observe for archival material. Whether you happen on it in a hallway labeled for oblivion, rescue it from your parents' attic, seek it out by recording an interview, or curate it from your own desk or computer, ideally, the next trove of archival material will come from you. Regardless of your field of industry, including the domestic realm, and this holds true for both men and women today in a way that it might not have a century ago. You are continuously generating material, documenting the life you're leading, and it has value. While you're looking at your own material, reach out to your mother, to your grandmother, and ask what they still have. Don't let the generations before us downsize to a dumpster. Let them know that their experience matters, and help them share their narrative through whatever material they've preserved. In order to contribute your own voice to the historical record, unlike your parents and grandparents, you might have to tease it out of some digital noise. Whether you see it as an act of self-curation or of simple documentation, you'll have to be as proactive as were the scrapbooking women before you in selecting material to save, even digital material. And you'll have to be much more proactive than all of those women who assumed the evidence of their life and work had no value. It had value. It has value. Find it and share it. They can't write about us if we aren't there. Thank you.